Simeon, thanks for joining me today in this Shoptalk Live special podcast.
Good to be here.
Thank you. And thanks for making the time, because I know that you're very busy, so time is scarce. For the audience to get acquainted with you, maybe you can tell me about your role, what you do in your job.
Sure.
Who you are.
Who I am. So good to be here. It's nice to do one of these in person. It's been a long time since I've recorded one of these in person. So I'm a analyst at the Bank of Montreal, or BMO Capital Markets, which is the part of the Bank of Montreal. Mm-hmm. I focus on analyzing generally publicly traded retailers and brands that constantly work through this evolution beauty of retail. My day job is to chronicle, assess, analyze all these companies from an individual stock perspective. But what really gets me going is understanding the cultural shifts that are happening across the industry and focusing heavily on the actual stories as opposed to the ones that are told by media headlines and management teams and all of us, because at heart we're all consumers before we do anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the beauties of being like in this consumer goods and retail world, that it's like really brands that you can touch and feel and see every day how they're doing, you know?
So it's funny, I like to joke with myself because I make bad jokes with myself.
I make them publicly, which is probably worse.
Listen, as long as I'm laughing on the inside is what counts. But I like to think there are people that do what I do at my firm for every sector.
Yeah.
So there's someone who analyzes companies for semiconductors. There's someone who analyzes companies for technologies companies. There's someone who does media, et cetera. I like to think that analyzing biotech is much easier than analyzing retail. Because analyzing biotech is easy because it is such a hard industry. You know what you're analyzing. Whereas I think analyzing retail is much harder because it's such an easy sector. And we all think we're experts. We all bring our anecdotal storytelling and remember what my experience at Starbucks was this morning. Or think about how long...
Everyone can have an opinion on it, no?
And we all do.
Yeah.
And so the problem is, opinions aren't facts.
No.
And so what's fascinating is no one has an opinion about a random biotech. That's not a thing.
Unless you're very
analyzing.
niche in your personal taste.
But yeah, to each their own. Listen, we are in Vegas. But at the end of the day, everyone has an opinion when it comes to consumer. And what that means is that the story can deviate from reality a lot.
Yeah, that's true. And I know that you appear quite often on TV and stuff like that, right?
You can't. I'm blushing. I have various media exposure where it's just an interesting opportunity to, again, talk through what is actually happening, to think about what are those stories being portrayed, because I think the media does a really nice job at teeing them up and then seeing where we take it.
Yeah, cool. And you're specialized in retail. Is that like in fashion or all across the board? Companies that have like physical stores and online, I don't know.
Yeah, so the way I like to think about my mandate is that it focuses on consumer discretionary. I like to think I would not be very good, I don't think, at analyzing unit velocity of a cereal box. And plenty of people are, so that's a failing of mine among many. What gets me going is thinking about when a company can take a need and turn it into a want. And what I mean by that is we all wear clothing.
Yeah.
But no one would call a pair of Lululemon leggings clothing. We all, maybe some of us, exercise, but no one would look at a Peloton and call it just a bike.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard of this company Traeger, but we all cook and eat, but no one would look at a Traeger and call it an oven. So this notion of when you can take something that people need, when you can take food, shelter, or clothing and turn it into a brand and charge pricing premium, like to convince someone to pay more for something that simply because there's an emotional attachment, that's what gets me going. So my mandate is consumer discretionary in whatever form that takes. That could be health and wellness. It could be apparel. It could be beauty goods. It could be, maybe it is even new branded cereal. Who knows? But it's that idea of being able to focus on the power of a brand.
Yeah, cool. And probably everybody asks you this question, how do you see retail nowadays? And what's happening? Because obviously we're coming from like a very unique scenario of like a global pandemic and so on.
So my view is it's very easy to make broad brushstrokes, and anytime there's a broad brushstroke, it's probably wrong.
Yeah.
So when I think about how I see retail, It's no different than how I think we saw retail a year ago, how we'll see retail 10 years from now.
Okay.
The question's the nuance. And so there's always going to be extraneous factors. Hopefully there will never be global pandemics again, but there is always going to be extraneous factors. Is supply chain good or bad? Is there a lot of inventory or too little? Do companies feel empowered to pull back promotions, or does the consumer have the leverage to demand them? What is the fashion cycle? How are the commodities? Did a warehouse burn down? My thought at the end of the day is the consumer, at least the U.S. consumer, which I know more than the global consumer, is fairly resilient. They can have external shocks and recessions can happen. But generally speaking, what I like to figure out, I like to look at product variance more than people variance. And what I mean by that is it doesn't matter how much milk you bought during the pandemic. You need more milk. That's why milk is inflationary. Milk costs more money because supply demand dictates that as people go to get more milk because they couldn't stock up on milk, they're going to pay more for it. I mentioned Peloton. Peloton's on the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Arguably a high-income purchase. But anyone who bought a Peloton doesn't need another one.
Yeah.
And so that becomes deflationary. And so I'm thinking about the world. When I think about retail, it's less high versus low income. And obviously, to not be insensitive, there's obviously very real impacts. Inflation impacts people very differently. But I think it's, at the end of the day, people are buying milk and they're not buying Pelotons. Which is the low income purchase? Which is the high income purchase? It's more so which is the replenishment purchase. And so I think there will always be external shocks. But by the way, when inventory is light, that also means the inventory is scarce.
Yeah.
So there's just different ways of looking at this. So I'm generally optimistic about the ability to retail. And perhaps the questions I ask are around who's doing it effectively.
Yeah. And also, like, what about like the you were talking about like scarcity and so on. What's the situation now with the whole inventory, excess inventories in fashion and so on, which I heard a lot about. But I've been in the US for a couple of weeks now. I don't feel like the clothes are as cheap as I thought they would be.
Yeah, I don't think we've had the discounts that people think we have, and it goes back again, reality versus the numbers. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was no inventory. Prices went through the roof.
Yeah.
During the pandemic, companies believed that the good times now, and we say good times very ironically, but when people were buying a lot, because people bought a lot during the pandemic, the companies believed that would last forever, and they bought accordingly. And they raised their inventory levels. They also did it because the supply chain issues meant that for the first time in a long time, you actually couldn't predict supply. I like to think that retail is very hard business because, analyzing retail was hard. Being a retailer is also very hard because being a retailer, you have to forecast demand.
Yeah.
And so you have to figure out, you either leave too much on the table or have too much product left over, neither of which are good scenarios. It's a hard job. But during the pandemic, you also had to predict supply. That changes the conversation entirely. Certain people, certain brands, or certain companies are better at predicting demand, but everyone was in the same boat when it came to predicting supply. It didn't exist.
Yeah.
So what that meant was you put in orders for whatever you could get. If you could make it, I'll take it. What basically became the mantra. And so what happened was people thought the good times of demand would roll forever, and they couldn't get enough product, so they started ordering it just in case. Obviously, the demand slowed and faltered, and we were left holding a lot of pile of inventory.
Yeah.
And so that's where we were. And so the thought was, there's so much inventory, people are going to be promotional. It didn't manifest yet. But what you can see is you actually start seeing certain brands are. And so that's why, so we're at Shoptalk, I did a panel, and someone asked a question of what do you think the year of 23 is going to be the year of, and pick a word, and my word was divergence. Because I think what we're now going to see is we're going to see which companies are actually focusing on protecting all this price lift, protecting the brand equity that they elevated over the last several years, versus who's simply going to chase demand, chase units, because that's been the problem for retail over the last many decades. Growth for growth's sake without thinking about profits.
No, it's interesting to see like what brands you find in TJ Maxx or Ross Dress for Less versus the ones that you don't find. And you see a very clear pattern.
Yeah.
Right?
Now, it's interesting you bring them up because I would actually argue that the off-price channels, so TJ, Ross, Burlington, I think they actually serve a very important role for retail.
Yeah.
Especially in a world where brands do want to go more direct. You and I have alluded to the impact of direct, so we'll save that if you want to go there. But as brands don't want to be seen in department stores with online discounts being sent out left and right, friends and family sale here, liquidation, whatever it is. Off-price actually makes for a very interesting place to sell a lot of units.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to think that off-price wins because they don't have e-commerce, not in spite of it. If you can't search for my product on tjmax.com, I actually want to give you, I, the brand, am much more comfortable putting stuff in your stores. Because once that product leaves the store, no one knows where it came from. There's no email, there's no broadcast, and I can't search. I need to make the effort to walk in and take it. And so do you do that en masse? No. But I actually think that it's an invisible, the off-price affords an invisible sale to the brands. And that can be drastically better when you think about brand protection.
Oh, interesting. So that was me, like, as a consumer, giving my opinion on retail, right?
By the way, most people see it the way you see it. So, like, again, I can be opinionated, I could be wrong. But to me, Nike has been talking about this huge push, differentiated versus undifferentiated retail. I think it's more interesting to think about, or separately interesting. I don't have to be normative here. I think it's interesting to look at visible versus invisible retail. I think if I'm a brand, I want to have visible retail be my own direct presence that I can control and I can elevate, but I still need to sell a lot of units. Those go through pallets that are dropped off at TJ, and I can invisibly move them. That math can work.
Okay. Talking about Nike, by the way, I saw you publish something the other day about them, and obviously it's been a lot in the press. So they made, I don't know, it was 2020 or 2021, they made like a statement that they were really going to invest in the direct channel, so online and obviously the physical retail. Now they seem like they want to push back into wholesale, so working with the likes of, the typical one is Foot Locker. How do you see that?
Yeah, so I want to preface by saying there's no company like Nike. What Nike has done from a size and scale perspective is mind-blowingly impressive. So that's the preempt.
In what way?
The sheer size. So I generally am very committed to looking at numbers. I wouldn't be a good imaginary, visionary founder because I tend to look at the past to predict the future. Which helps me a lot in terms of operating, and for the most part, it helps me a lot until someone comes and writes a new rule, right? So the visionary founders break rules. I wouldn't see that coming, right? That's I think one of my failings. But until that happens, I care about the numbers because the numbers are what's the truth, and the numbers will tell me what's to come. Nike is far and away the largest, well, definitely in apparel. Perhaps Apple would be the one that we'd contest, but. So I won't say Nike is the largest. Nike is one of the largest sellers of branded product in the history of time. They dwarf everyone else. And they're also one of the best storytellers, great marketers. So there's a lot of fantastic, Nike is a success story on so many fronts. That's no brilliant insight from me. A handful of years ago, they came out and announced they're going to focus on the consumer direct offense. I don't remember if they started it or if they were part of it, but the wave of going direct, we know it as D2C, digitally native. It just it took on a life of its own. Companies were not product companies, they were channel companies. D2C became an identity, not a selling distribution. That doesn't make any sense, but that was it, right? Are you a mattress company or do you sell mattresses direct? So what happened for it's a whole separate podcast episode, we can talk about this, but what's happening? So 2 years ago, my team published a report that we entitled D2C is not all it's cracked up to be.
Is not?
Is not all it's cracked up to be.
Okay.
And you need a little flair in the title. And it was wildly controversial. What we showed in that report was that mathematically, brands pivoting direct did not see a relative increase in revenue, gross margin, operating profit dollars, or operating margin. And all four of those, I just glossed over them. They were all shockingly contrarian. Most people didn't agree with them. Frankly, I didn't agree with them until I did it. It was a 2-week note that turned into a 6-month research process because we just kept pulling strings and we were shocked by every finding we had. That was 2 years ago. What's happened since is we've seen quarter after quarter. And by the way, this was the largest publicly traded brand. This was Nike, among many others. It was also the smallest digitally natives. It was the same thing. Going direct, wholesale was viewed as the villain. That was wrong.
Like a necessary evil, no, kind of thing.
Everyone believed, let me cast aside the middle person and keep that fee, but forgetting the middle person served a role. So you need to pay for it.
Yeah.
And so what we found was that was the trajectory. 2 years later, I still get requests for this report, because again, it's just all empirically based. What we find is, for example, since you brought them up, this past quarter, I don't know when we're airing, but some point in the last month or
Very
so.
soon, in the next few days.
Okay. Nike recently reported their quarter. Sales revenues grew 14%.
Yeah.
Profit dollars, EBIT, operating profit dollars, dropped almost 14%.
Wow.
And so there's a lot of nuance. There's supply chain, there's discount, like all these different, there's always different things.
Yeah.
But we continue to find, as direct grows, it doesn't do what people intuitively believe it will do. And so, to be very clear, I'm not anti-direct. I'm anti-wholesale.
Yeah.
And I'm not, and I said anti-wholesale as opposed to I love wholesale, because you can do wholesale wrong too.
Yeah.
It's you need to have the right partnerships. And so, wildly long-winded answer to a very straightforward question. What I think is happening right now, Nike was so vocal about going direct. I don't think it's reasonable to expect them to announce an about face. But what we can see is it does appear they are re-embracing some of their strategic wholesale accounts. You mentioned Foot Locker, but it does seem like they're acknowledging that it should not be direct at the expense of wholesale.
Yeah.
It should be omni-channel, where each version, and you're optimizing how you sell, how and where you sell your product.
So you think it's going to go more to like, yes, direct and yes, wholesale, but maybe more selective wholesale?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
For example?
I think that's fair. I think it's it's viewing it as a partnership.
Yeah.
Companies, now I will be prescriptive or normative. Companies should have a product that they believe maniacally they can sell. Mm-hmm. Then they need to figure out how to get it to the consumer. That last part, that's an execution question. That's not an identity question.
Yeah.
It should not be, execution is all about the nuance.
Yeah.
It's not about the theme. The product has a storytelling around it. The execution is simply nuts and bolts. Who will best sell my product so that it enhances my future value? Mm-hmm. Because I can best sell my product today if I cut the price and blast out big discounts. That's not good either.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's an execution. I think you're absolutely right, or at least I would agree, that it's all about strategically partnering up and knowing that they care, interests are aligned.
Okay. By the way, you mentioned before Peloton. I mean, we can use them as an example. And I'm interested in your opinion. Like, you mentioned that it's like a product that you don't buy. I mean, obviously you don't buy it very often. Like, when you buy like one of these bikes, you expect it to last at least 5 years. What about like, how can a company like that actually survive? Because
oh boy. No, that's a good question. So here's the thing. Peloton has created a fantastically powerful community. Mm-hmm. Peloton, I've been praising Nike for their storytelling.
Yeah.
There was, for a point of time, I think Peloton had marketing and storytelling on par with Nike and Apple.
Okay.
Like, they were the best. The problem is that not everyone wants to exercise, for better or worse.
Yeah.
The problem is not everyone is going to be able or willing to pay the price of a Peloton bike, which is all different versions of me saying the addressable market is not infinite.
Yeah.
And so Peloton, the issue with Peloton as a stock became people would see 4 vans driving down their street to drop off Pelotons, and they would extrapolate that and believe that there were 4 vans driving down every street in the world. That sounds asinine now, and yet those were the conversations we were having. We were very, in the spirit of being contrarian, so I've had what's called a sell rating on Peloton for a long time.
What's that?
Part of my job is to publish reports with views on stocks. Uh-huh. I've been publicly negative on Peloton the stock, while being very publicly positive about Peloton the product. And so your question of how does it last as a company, most people have a very good reception and perspective of their bike. I love my Peloton. Yeah. We publish reports, and for a long time, I think at the last line of most of the reports would say something to the effect of recommend the bike, not the shares. Okay. And so there's a distinction between thinking about companies and stocks in the same way there's a distinction between thinking about growth versus stability. I think Peloton, if they focus on bear hugging their loyalists can be a very healthy business if they're just focused on collecting the monthly subscription.
Yeah.
The monthly subscription for existing users is a very healthy margin business. Problem is, every time they try to sell a new bike, I'm going to be hyperbolic, it causes them to lose money. And so knowing Peloton I think, has been a great lesson for a lot of areas of consumer and a lot of companies over the pandemic for a lot of different ways. One, every company, when the pandemic first happened, companies saw their business collapse. Then a lot of them saw their business explode in a positive way.
Yeah.
Then it stabilized at this incredibly healthy demand. They thought it would last forever. So they overpurchased, they bought their business accordingly, and then the business collapsed.
Yeah.
Peloton was the loudest, but a lot of discretionary businesses look like that.
Yeah.
And so the question became, what each of those phases that I just outlined, what was the order of magnitude? What was the duration? And when did they happen? And more importantly than anything I just said, in response, the most dangerous period there was the stability period. When you had this incredibly high level of demand,
that was like
dictating
2021 approximately, no?
Exactly. When you had that high level of demand dictating your choices.
Yeah.
Did you over inventory your business, or did you over infrastructure your business? If you over inventoried, it's going to be painful, but you get through it. You figure it out. You just have to reset. If you over infrastructured, that's a much more complicated setup. If you completely reorganized your entire structure around the belief that it would exponential growth,
last forever,
that's a much more painful process.
Yeah. Why did you seem to be fairly analytical? Why did companies think this would last forever? Like, I'm laughing because it's like this. It's happened in the Great Recession, in the Great Depression in 1929.
So
why don't we learn? Or when will we learn?
So I think you asked the question perfectly. You said, why don't companies learn?
Yeah.
Why did companies make this mistake? Companies didn't make the mistake. People made the mistake. The problem is, companies are run by people.
Yeah.
People are emotional. It goes back to full circle to our conversation. Consumer is so hard because it's so easy.
Yeah.
We all see this excitement.
Yeah.
In January of 2021, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, stimulus, and again, I'm going to speak for the U.S. market. Stimulus gave everyone a capacity to spend.
That was crazy.
Pent-up demand because of the vaccine gave everyone a desire to spend. There was no inventory out there. So the price points you had to spend on were through the roof.
Yeah.
That's the perfect trifecta of retailing. There has never been a better time, again, being hyperbolic, so maybe there was, but there's never been a better time to be a retailer than in the first half of 2021.
Yeah.
That's when, let's get biblical here, like Joseph rose to be the viceroy of Egypt because in the 7 years of famine, the 7 years of feast that preempted the 7 years of famine, he planned. That was very unique. People don't do that.
Yeah, no.
And it's because we don't, and understandably, we're not robots. But that's where the past predicting the future point is very important.
Yeah.
That's where understanding that when we approach, whether it's analyzing or operating and executing in retail or consumer, we need to isolate. We need to identify and then isolate our baggage because we all bring personal baggage, good or bad.
Yeah.
If you can do that, then all of a sudden you look back and say the Peloton story just seems so obvious. I can tell you how many people yelled at me when it wasn't obvious.
Yeah, I can imagine. That would be for probably a whole other conversation. So I was speaking with a CEO yesterday that I met here in the show, that was telling me that other CEO friends of his were like, the last 3 years were like the toughest in my whole life. I'm getting out of here and I don't want to be CEO again. And we're seeing a lot of companies that where the CEO is changing, right? How do you see that, like, change in leadership? Like, and what type of also like leadership will companies need these days?
That's a great question. We just talked about how Joseph became the second in command of Egypt. I think he was a slave beforehand, right? Like, when these things change, the leader changes.
Yeah.
And so if the last, however, decade plus was identified or can be associated best with growth, there are certain companies that are growth companies, certain leaders that are growth leaders, and then there are others that are restructuring turnaround leaders.
Yeah.
They're very different skill sets, neither of which is better or worse. It's just knowing who needs to be attached to what.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I agree. It does seem to be there's a changing of the guard. The question may be, is it simply a function of age? Is it simply that if you were leading a company in the last 15 years, it was fun, it was easy, in air quotes, so why give it up? But all of a sudden it's a little harder. Is it worth your while, right? If you don't need to do it, do you continue to do it? On the other hand, is it time for do you need a new leader, right? So I think it is interesting isolating your question in terms of who's changing because they want to versus who's changing because they have to.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's an interesting one. But of course, like changing like the chip from like a very different scenario to this one where we're going into a bit of a, like an unknown ground.
Yeah, it's always going to be unknown. Like that's what retail is always hard.
Yeah.
And so it's not harder now than it was before. It's a different type of hard.
Yeah.
And it demands a different fortitude or different type of approach.
Yeah.
Figuring out, evolving, adapting. Listen, we all say it, right? Retail is a constant evolution, and if you can't be flexible, you die.
Yeah.
But that was true pre-pandemic as well.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking to people that are saying it's the hardest they've ever had. On the other hand, in 2019 or however long, we were talking about death of retail, death of the mall. Like retail was toxic. Again, air quotes. So
no, but it was the conversation.
Yeah. So I think people forgetting, it's horrible now.
Yeah.
Really? Your price points are above 19.
Yeah.
Your consumer is now willing to increasingly give you a little bit more latitude on shipping times. I've even seen a growing amount of people that are charging for returns. Like, you can argue that in certain instances, the retailers actually regained a tremendous amount of power.
Yeah.
So I think it's easy to complain. It's easy to paint that broad brushstroke. And I think that's where, whenever that happens, is worth digging in a little bit more.
And clearly our memory is very short in general, I think.
It's the beauty of being human.
Yeah, exactly, I guess. What about, like, if you think of, like, 2025, is there anything that you would think would change? Because you seem to, from what I'm seeing of your thinking, you believe, like, it cycles, no, really? So, I don't know, where will we be in 2025?
I think everything will change and we'll be doing the exact same thing. Right? I think that, yeah, of course, it's going to be advancement. It's going to be innovation. But at the end of the day, I will tell you the absolute best way to retail is the old way to retail.
Which is?
Fill a store, pay your employees, have optimal product, merchandise appropriately, and then you scale that business. Because one of the biggest problems with e-commerce structurally is that it's all variable. That you have to pick, pack, ship, fulfill, return, every single thing. The costs don't stop. Whereas you pay your rent on a store, you pay your employees your hourly rate, and you buy your inventory, every incremental person that comes in is a better margin.
Yeah.
And so, again, at some point you have to bring in more employees, and at some point you have to buy or rent a bigger store, but that's good problems. But for the most part, fixed costs, having people interact. I mean, think about it this way. What e-commerce did was it transferred a job from a customer onto an employee.
Yeah.
Customers walk into stores, they pick, pack, ship, fulfill it themselves. It's called taking it off a shelf, walking it over the cash register, excitedly putting it in their bag.
Yeah.
That was a lot cheaper than asking your employee to do it for you.
Yeah.
And so at the heart of it, to watch all these technical innovations and believe they're going to supersede is scary. Whereas if the technical innovations can help the actual experience, and again, it has to be omni. I'm not advocating anti-e-com, but to try and figure out if everyone had a choice, and they obviously do not, you should prefer to generate every incremental dollar of sale in store. You leverage it. You don't have that choice. But if you did, and so as we're directing all of our AI efforts, I think directing them towards things that are actually complementing the existing and amplifying the existing is probably the best course.
Well, there we go. Well, thanks for joining me, Simeon. It's been a pleasure. It's been a lot of fun.
You too. Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you.